Hello, everyone. We are Group 2 and welcome to our presentation. Today, our group will be analyzing a landmark Canadian administrative law case, which is the Canada Attorney General versus Igloo Vikski, reported in 2016, Volume 2 of the Supreme Court Reports, page 80. So here is my group members. I am Diana Rose Gutierrez, and here is Garv Gosain and Saroj Guru. Um, we'll be using the IRAC framework, the issue, rule, application, and conclusion to break down the case. The goal of this analysis is to understand the key legal questions, the reasoning of the court, and the broader impact on administrative law and import classification in Canada. This case revolves around the classification of imported Haki-Guwali masks, which had a significant impact on whether or not customs duties would be applied. It also serves as an important example of how courts approach the standard of review when evaluating decisions made by specialized administrative tribunals. So for the facts of the case, Igloo Vikski imported ice hockey goalie mask into Canada. So the Canada Border Services Agency or the CBSA classified this mask as safety headgear, which meant they were subject to customs duties. Igloo disagreed, arguing that they should be classified as sports equipment, which would be duty-free. The classification mattered financially because safety headgear had tariffs, while sports equipment did not. The dispute eventually reached the Canadian International Trade Tribunal or the CITT and later the Supreme Court of Canada. So this is the Supreme Court judgment of the case, the Canada Attorney General versus Igloo Vikski Incorporated. Now that we understand the background, let's move on to the legal issues that guided the court's analysis. There were two main legal issues before the court. The first one, what is the proper tariff classification for the imported quali masks under the customs tariff? And lastly, what is the correct standard of review for the CITT's decision? Now I'll hand it over to Garv to continue the presentation.
Hello everyone. In this case, the court relied on two important legal rules. First, the customs tariff. This law sets out how imported goods are classified, and that classification directly determines whether duties apply. It's not just a label, it impacts how much money an importer has to pay at the border. A single classification decision can make huge financial difference for a business. Second, decisions made by Canadian International Trade Tribunal or CITT can be reviewed by courts but under administrative law principles at that time. The standard of review was reasonableness. Reasonableness means that the court isn't asking is the best decision. It's asking is this a decision that falls under the reasonable range of outcomes, even if there are other ways to interpret the possible decision. This rule reflects the idea that specialized tribunals like CITT have expertise in their fields and that courts should respect that expertise unless the decision is clearly unreasonable. This principle of difference was central to how the Supreme Court approached the case. Next slide, please. The majority of the Supreme Court applied that the reasonableness should be the standard which is upheld by the CITT decision. The tribunal had classified the Goli masks under Tariff Code 6506.10.10, which is the category for safety headgear. That meant that the masks were subject to custom duty rather than being duty-free sports equipment. The court emphasized that the custom classification can involve detailed and technical judgments about the product's design, function, and use, and that's where the CITT's expertise comes in. The majority said that even though someone could make a reasonable argument that classifying the masks as sports equipment the CITT's reasoning for calling them safety headgear was still valid. In other words, the decision didn't have to be the correct answer, it just had to be the reasonable one. And because the tribunal followed the proper process and applied its expertise, the majority concluded that its decision should stand. Next slide, please. The Justice Cote took a different view and wrote a strong dissenting opinion. She believed that the correct standard of review here should have been correctness and not reasonableness. Her reasoning was that the classification of goods under the custom tariff is a question of law, and the question of law required definitiveness. The correct answer should not just be reasonable one. From her perspective, the goalie masks were sports equipment specifically designed for playing hockey and therefore should not have been duty free. She also argued that the deferring too much to the tribunal risks, risks the letting legal errors go uncorrected. Her dissent highlights a long running debate in Canadian administrative law. Should the courts always defer to the specialized tribunals, or should they step in more often to ensure that the law is applied correctly? This agreement foreshadowed later legal developments, including the Vavilov decision in 2019, which refined the Canadian court's approach, the standard of the review. And now I'll be giving the baton to my colleague Saroj.
Thank you, Gaurav. Now I want to talk about the conclusion part of the presentation. To conclude the case, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in favor of the Attorney General of Canada. This means that the court agreed with the original decision made by the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, or we call it CITT, which had classified hockey goalie mask as safety headgear rather than sports equipment. This classification is important because it meant the products were subject to import duties, which Igloo Vikski had been trying to avoid. The court applied the reasonableness standard in reviewing the tribunal's decision. They did not ask whether the CITT was right in a strict legal sense, but they were seeing if the decision was reasonable. So overall, the court said the CITT's ruling made sense and should stand. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk about the legal impact. This case had a significant legal impact, especially in the area of administrative law. First, it reinforced the idea that courts should defer to administrative bodies like the CITT when it comes to technical or specialized decisions. It also confirmed that the appropriate standard of review for this type of cases is reasonableness, not correctness. This case also had a significant effect on the Vavilov decision, which updated how courts review decisions made by administrative tribunals. And finally, this case has had a real implication for businesses, especially for importers. It showed that customs classification can significantly affect the amount of duties owed. So, next slide, please. Now I want to talk about the critical analysis. So from a critical perspective, this case raised some ongoing debates in Canadian law. One major issue is the debate between correctness and reasonableness when reviewing tribunal decision. Some legal scholars argue that when it comes to interpreting laws, courts should step in and apply the correct legal answer, even if the tribunal view is reasonable. Others say that deference is better, especially when the tribunal has subject matter expertise. For businesses, this case highlights the challenge of dealing with ambiguous classification. For example, is hockey mask sport equipment or protective headgear? These distinctions can have huge financial impacts. And finally, this case speaks to the broader trend of giving administrative tribunals more power. It shows that courts are often reluctant to interfere, even when the issues involve legal interpretation, which has long-term implication for how law is applied in Canada. And thank you, and this concludes our presentation.